The Montana Valley held its breath, caught between the memory of autumn and the promise of winter. Along the winding creek, the cottonwoods had shed their gold, their leaves now a brittle carpet crackling underfoot. The mountains that ringed the Thorn Ranch stood immense and silent, their peaks already brushed with a stark white that warned of the coming cold, a cold that could kill the unprepared. The land was beautiful, but it was a hard beauty, one that offered no comfort and made no promises it could not keep. Jacob Thorn moved through this landscape like a ghost haunting his own life. At 32, he had the broad shoulders and calloused hands of a man who worked from sunup to sundown. But the strength in his body was a hollow shell. It was his eyes that told the real story. They were the color of a winter sky and held a vast, empty stillness. 3 years. It had been 3 years since diphtheria had swept through his home, taking his wife, Sarah, and their 6-year-old son, Thomas, in the space of a single, terrible week. 3 years, and the silence they left behind had grown into a physical thing, a presence that sat with him at his supper table and lay beside him in his cold bed. He was mending a fence line on the north pasture, his movements precise and mechanical. The cold bit at his raw knuckles as he stretched the wire taut, his breath pluming in the crisp air. He worked without stopping, without thought, welcoming the ache in his muscles because it was a feeling he could understand, a pain that was simple and clean. It was the other pain, the quiet, gnawing ache in his chest that he could not fix. His cabin, once filled with the scent of Sarah's baking and the sound of Thomas's rowdy laughter, was now just a wooden box to hold his grief. Every object was a torment. The small rocking chair by the hearth, the one he had built for Sarah, sat empty. The faint scent of lavender still clung to the quilt on their bed, a scent he sometimes caught on the air, and it was enough to bring him to his knees. He remembered the weight of his son on his shoulders as they walked the fields, the small, sticky hand that used to slip into his. These memories were not gentle whispers, they were sharp, cruel daggers that found him in the quiet moments. He had walled himself off from the world, from any chance of feeling anything at all. He spoke to his few ranch hands, Silas and the younger boys, only when necessary. His words were clipped, practical commands about the herd or the weather. He never asked about their families, never shared a joke or a story. He was the boss, the owner of the land, but he was not their friend. They gave him a wide berth, respecting his sorrow from a safe distance. A trip into the nearby town of Prosperity was an ordeal he endured only when supplies ran low. He was a respected man there. The Thorn Ranch was one of the largest in the valley. Men would nod to him as he walked down the dusty main street. "Thorn," they would say, their voices sober. But no one ever clapped him on the shoulder. No one invited him for a drink at the saloon. He was a monument to tragedy, a reminder of how quickly a life could be shattered. The townswomen were worse. They would look at him with a mixture of sympathy and pity, their eyes soft and sad. Each one of those looks was a fresh stab in an old wound, a reminder of what he had lost, of the gaping hole in his life that everyone could see. He avoided the places that held too many memories. The general store, where Sarah had loved to browse the bolts of fabric, the small white church on the hill, where he had married her and, 3 years ago, buried her and their son side by side. He had not stepped inside it since. His tragedy was his anchor, a heavy weight that kept him moored in the past. He had long since forgotten how to live without it. Several miles from the Thorn Ranch, where the valley floor began to climb into the untamed foothills, Elara Vance lived in a world of her own making. Her small cabin was nestled in a grove of aspens, almost invisible to a passing rider. It was a modest home, built by her father's hands, but it was a place of meticulous order. Bunches of dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the single room with the mingled scents of sage, yarrow, and pine. A small shelf held a collection of worn books, their spines cracked from countless readings. On the other side of the room, tools of a different kind were neatly arranged, hide scrapers and awls passed down from her Lakota mother. At 28, Ilara possessed a strength that was quiet but unmistakable. It was in the steady gaze of her intelligent, watchful eyes, the color of dark honey. It was in the capable set of her hands. Her heritage was written in the proud lines of her face, in the warm tone of her skin, and the straight, black hair she kept tied back with a simple leather cord. In the world of prosperity, this heritage marked her as an outsider, a person who belonged nowhere. A deep and abiding loneliness was her constant companion. She yearned for connection, for the simple comfort of a shared word or a friendly face, but that longing was always held in check by a lifetime of fear and prejudice. Her past was a landscape of loss as stark as Jacob Thorne's. Her father, a white trapper who had loved her mother fiercely and taught Ilara to read from his own small library, had been killed by a grizzly when she was just a teenager. Her Lakota mother, who had been cast out by her own people for marrying a white man, had withered in the years that followed, shunned by the town for her race and grieving for the husband who had been her entire world. She had faded from a broken heart and a sickness the white doctor could not name. A year after her husband's death, she was gone. For years now, Ilara had survived alone. She lived by the knowledge her parents had given her, the healing arts from her mother, the world of words and letters from her father. She knew every plant in the valley, which roots could soothe a fever, which leaves could draw out infection, which flowers could ease a troubled mind. The people of prosperity used this knowledge, but they did so with a shame that bordered on contempt. They would come to her for help, but never in the light of day. They sought her remedies in hushed desperation, then called her names in the safety of the town. Just last week, a frantic knocking had woken her in the dead of night. It was Mrs. Gable, the blacksmith's wife, her face pale with terror in the lantern light. Her youngest son was burning with a fever, his breathing shallow and ragged. Ilara had worked quickly, preparing a poultice of crushed herbs that smelled of damp earth and mint. As she handed the small cloth bundle to the woman, Mrs. Gable had pressed a few coins into her palm, her eyes darting nervously toward the dark trail. "Please," the woman had whispered, her voice trembling, "do not tell anyone I was here. My husband, he would not understand." That single, hurried encounter was the story of Ilara's life. She was a secret, a last resort. She was needed, but she was reviled, a ghost in her own land. Her only true solace was in the natural world. She felt a spiritual connection to the landscape, an inheritance from her mother that ran deeper than blood. She understood the language of the wind in the pines, the rhythm of the changing seasons. Here, in the wild, she was not judged. The earth did not care about the color of her skin or the name she was called. It simply was, and it allowed her to be, too. The day had started like any other on the Thorne Ranch. The air was cold, the work was hard, and the silence was deep. Jacob was overseeing the separation of the bulls from the main herd, a dangerous but necessary task before the winter set in. Caleb, his youngest and most trusted hand, was in the pen, his movements quick and sure for a boy of only 19. He was a good kid, quiet and hard-working, and Jacob felt a flicker of something almost paternal for him. Then, in an instant, the world tilted into chaos. One of the bulls, a massive, ill-tempered beast, spun unexpectedly. Caleb, caught off guard, had no time to scramble up the fence. The bull lowered its head, and a collective shout of horror went up from the other hands as the animal drove its horn deep into the boy's thigh. The next few minutes were a blur of panicked action. They managed to distract the bull and drag Caleb out of the pen, his face a waxy, bloodless white. The wound was a horrifying sight, a deep, ragged tear that was pouring blood onto the dusty ground. They carried him to the bunkhouse and laid him on a cot, his breaths coming in shallow, painful gasps. Panic rippled through the men. The town doctor was in Stillwater, a full day's ride in good weather. But the sky to the west was a bruised, angry purple, and the wind was picking up, carrying the sharp scent of snow. A storm was brewing, a bad one. By nightfall, the trail would be impassable. "He's losing too much blood, boss," one of the men said, his voice shaking. Jacob stared at the spreading crimson stain on the makeshift bandage, a cold, familiar dread seizing him. He felt the same crushing helplessness that had overwhelmed him as he sat by the bedsides of his wife and son, watching the life drain out of them, powerless to stop it. He could not, would not, let it happen again. The thought of losing another person under his care, of being a helpless spectator to death one more time, was unbearable. It was Silas, the grizzled old-timer who had worked for Jacob's father, who finally broke the terrified silence. His voice was low, laced with a superstition that was common in these isolated parts. "There's the woman," he said, not looking at Jacob directly. "The one up in the hills, the mixed-blood woman." The other men shifted uncomfortably. They muttered amongst themselves, their fear mingling with a deep-seated prejudice. Indian medicine, witchcraft, things they did not understand and therefore did not trust. "She saved my dog last summer," Silas pressed on, seeing the flicker of desperation in Jacob's eyes. "He got bit by a rattler. Vet said he was a goner. She put one of her strange poultices on him, and the swelling went right down. He was up and chasing rabbits in 2 days." Jacob looked from Silas's earnest, weather-beaten face to the pale, still form of Caleb on the cot. The boy's life was bleeding out with every tick of the clock, the town's prejudice, his own ingrained caution. It all felt like a luxury he could no longer afford. The image of young Caleb, so full of life just an hour before, overrode everything else. He had to try. He had to do something. Without another word, Jacob turned and strode out of the bunkhouse, his long legs eating up the ground toward the stables. He would not stand by and watch another person die. Not this time. The ride was a brutal fight against the coming storm. The wind howled down from the mountains, whipping at Jacob's face with icy teeth. He urged his fastest horse, Apollo, up the winding trail, his mind a maelstrom of doubt and desperation. He was riding to seek help from a woman the whole town shunned, a woman he himself had only ever heard of in fearful whispers. He found her cabin just as the last of the daylight was being swallowed by the bruised sky. A thin curl of smoke rose from its stone chimney, and a single lantern cast a warm, yellow glow from the window. It was a small beacon of light against the vast, darkening landscape. He dismounted, his legs stiff from the hard ride, and approached the door with a heavy sense of trepidation. What was he doing here? What would he even say? He knocked, his knuckles rapping sharply against the rough-hewn wood. The sound was swallowed by the wind. After a long moment, the door creaked open, and she stood there, silhouetted against the lamplight. They stood in silence, 2 solitary worlds colliding on a windswept hill. He saw not the witch from the town's gossip, but a woman with weary, intelligent eyes that held a deep, guarded stillness. Her face was etched with a quiet strength that was both surprising and compelling. Ilara saw not the aloof, powerful rancher from the valley below, but a man stripped bare by desperation. It was there in the hard set of his jaw, the tension in his broad shoulders, and most of all, in his eyes. She saw a raw, open wound in his gaze, a pain that went far beyond the immediate crisis. He was the first to speak, his words curt, clipped by the urgency of his mission and his own discomfort. "They say you have skill with wounds," he said. It was not a question, but a blunt statement of fact. Ilara's posture was defensive, her arms crossed over her chest. She knew what men like him, men from the town, thought of her. She had seen the contempt in their eyes, heard the slurs they muttered when they thought she could not hear. "The town has a doctor," she replied, her voice cool and steady. She was testing him, seeing if his desperation was greater than his pride. "He's a day away," Jacob said, and for the first time, his voice cracked, betraying an emotion he worked so hard to conceal. The boy might not have that long. It was that small sound, that fissure in his stoic facade, that convinced her. In his raw vulnerability, she saw the ghost of a greater tragedy, the one the whole valley whispered about. This was not just a plea for his ranch hand, it was a plea against death itself. Without another word, she turned back into her cabin. He watched as she moved with a quiet efficiency, gathering supplies. She took clean linens from a wooden chest, several small clay jars of salves, and a pouch of dried herbs. When she was done, she pulled on a heavy wool cloak and looked at him, her dark eyes meeting his. She nodded once. She would come. The ride back to the ranch was a silent, brutal ordeal. The storm had broken in full force, and the wind howled around them like a hungry animal. Jacob had insisted she ride with him on Apollo, and he was now acutely aware of her presence behind him, her small frame pressed against his back for warmth and stability. It was an uncomfortable, forced intimacy, a physical closeness that felt strange and unsettling to a man who had not touched another person in 3 years. Through the roar of the wind, he could feel her resilience, the way she braced herself against the storm without complaint. A flicker of grudging respect began to form in the chaos of his thoughts. When they finally arrived back at the ranch, the yard was a whirlwind of snow and darkness. The suspicious stares of the other men followed them as Jacob lifted her down from the horse. Elara ignored them, her focus absolute. She pulled her cloak tighter around herself and walked directly toward the bunkhouse, her purpose a shield against their hostility. The moment she stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. The bunkhouse was a rough, masculine space, smelling of sweat, leather, and stale tobacco. But Elara transformed it into a sick room. Her movements were calm and sure. She gently unwrapped the bloody rags from Caleb's leg, her touch surprisingly gentle. Jacob watched, his initial desperation slowly giving way to a reluctant admiration for her skill. She sent Silas for hot water and began cleaning the wound with a dark, sharp-smelling infusion she made from willow bark she carried in her pouch. The wound was worse than Jacob had realized, deep and torn. He expected her to falter, but she did not. With a needle and thread from her kit, she began to stitch the gash with a steady, confident hand that surprised everyone. Most of all, Jacob. When the stitches were done, she applied a thick, pungent poultice of crushed leaves and roots, binding it tightly with clean linen. She gave Silas strict instructions on how to care for the boy, her voice even and authoritative. Keep him warm. Make him drink this tea every 2 hours, and do not let him move. Jacob watched her every move. He saw the way she spoke to Caleb, who was drifting in and out of consciousness, her voice a low, calming murmur. She was nothing like the wild, uncivilized woman of the town's malicious gossip. She was competent, focused, and possessed a quiet dignity that defied their prejudice. As he watched her work, he could not help but compare her quiet competence to the frantic helplessness he had felt when Sarah and Thomas were sick. He had been a bystander to their suffering. Elara was a fighter. He saw a strength in her that he had not seen in anyone, man or woman, for a very long time. Elara, for her part, was intensely aware of his gaze. She could feel the weight of his scrutiny, feel the simmering hostility from the other men in the room. But she walled it off, channeling all her energy, all her focus, into the life that lay in her hands. Her healing knowledge was her purpose. It was the only shield she had against the world's cruelty. When she was finished, the tension in the room had lessened slightly, replaced by a sense of exhausted awe. Caleb's breathing was deeper, more regular. Elara stood and began to pack her things, expecting nothing more than to be dismissed, sent back out into the storm now that her services were rendered. But as she turned to leave, Jacob stepped in front of her, blocking the door. "The storm is too strong," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and something else she could not name. "You'll stay in the main house, in the guest room." It was not a request. It was a statement, an order delivered with the quiet authority of a man used to being obeyed. For Elara, who had spent her entire life on the fringes, never expecting or receiving a kindness. The words landed with the force of a physical blow. It was the first act of decency, of protection, she had received from a white man since her father had died. She stared up at him, shocked into silence. He looked back at her, his expression unreadable. And in the space between them, in the howling of the wind outside and the sudden, charged quiet of the bunkhouse. They were left standing in a stunned, uncertain silence. The storm was a relentless beast, throwing snow against the cabin windows and screaming down the stone chimney. For 3 days, it held the valley in its grip, cutting the Thorn Ranch off from the rest of the world. Inside the main house, a different kind of storm was raging, a quiet, turbulent affair of unspoken thoughts and hovering ghosts. For Jacob, Ilara's presence was a profound disruption. He had cultivated his solitude for 3 years, wrapping the silence around himself like a shroud. Now, that silence was broken by the small sounds of another life. He heard her soft footsteps on the floorboards in the dead of night as she checked on Caleb. He smelled the sharp, earthy scent of the herbs she boiled on his stove, a strange and unfamiliar aroma that mingled with the ghosts of scents he tried so hard to forget, the smell of Sarah's yeast bread, of the soap she used to wash her hair. These domestic sounds and smells were agonizingly familiar, yet deeply unsettling, echoes of a life that was no longer his. A war was being fought within him. A part of him, the part that had been raised in prosperity, still heard the town's ugly whispers. He would find himself watching her, and a voice in his head, a voice that sounded a lot like the men he knew, would mutter about her blood, her ways. But another part of him, a part he had thought long dead, was undeniably drawn to her. He watched the graceful, economic way she moved, the intense focus in her dark eyes as she ground herbs with a stone pestle. He saw a competence that demanded respect and a quiet strength that shamed his own long surrender to grief. The cabin was no longer just a shell of memories. It was a shared space, and he felt like a stranger in his own home. He would watch her sitting by the fire, her hands busy shredding leaves into a bowl, and feel a confusing mix of resentment and fascination. He had not wanted this. He had not wanted anyone to breach the walls he had so carefully built around his heart. For Ilara, the house was both a fortress and a cage. For the first time in years, she was safe from the elements, warm and dry while the blizzard raged outside. But she was trapped in the home of a man who was a pillar of the very society that despised her. She slept in a proper bed with clean sheets, a luxury she had not known since she was a girl. She ate meals at a table, across from another person, but this comfort was laced with a profound and bitter unege. She felt the presence of Jacob's dead wife everywhere. It was in the piece of needlepoint hanging on the wall, a pastoral scene of a shepherd and his flock, stitched with careful, loving hands. It was in the worn floral pattern of the armchair cushions. Most of all, it was in the rocking chair by the hearth. She could almost see a woman sitting there, humming a soft tune, her face lit by the firelight. Ilara felt like a trespasser, an intruder, her very existence in this house, a woman of mixed blood sleeping in the guest room, felt like a violation of the memory of the woman who had once made this place a home. Their conversations were sparse, utilitarian, almost always circling back to the patient in the bunkhouse. "He needs to drink this," she would say, holding out a steaming mug of tea. Jacob would simply nod, take the mug, and carry it out into the storm. There were long, heavy silences between them, moments when the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind. Yet, in these shared silences, a different kind of communication began to unfold. It was a language of mutual observation. She noticed the way his hands, though rough and calloused, were surprisingly gentle when he stoked the fire. He noticed the way she would sometimes stare out the window at the swirling snow, her expression one of deep, impenetrable loneliness. They were two solitary people, trapped together by a storm, slowly beginning to recognize the shape of their own pain in the other's eyes. The crisis came on the second night. The wind was at its peak, rattling the very foundations of the cabin. Jacob had just returned from a final check on the cattle when Silas burst through the door, his face ashen with panic, a cloud of snow swirling in behind him. "It's Caleb," he gasped. "He's bad! Jacob, real bad!" They rushed to the bunkhouse to find the boy thrashing on his cot, his skin burning hot to the touch. He was delirious, muttering nonsense, his eyes wide and unseeing. The wound on his thigh, which had seemed to be healing, was now an angry, swollen red, oozing a foul-smelling liquid. The infection was spreading, poisoning his blood. The other two ranch hands stood back, their faces masks of fear and superstition. "It's a curse," one of them, a young man named Daniel, whispered. "It's her Indian medicine. It's done this to him." The accusation hung in the thick, lamplit air. The men were convinced Alara's remedies had soured, that she had put some kind of hex on the boy. Their fear, raw and primal, was turning to anger. "We got to send for the doctor," the other hand said. "Storm or no storm, we got to get a real doctor." The tension in the small room was explosive. Jacob looked at Caleb, his heart pounding with a familiar, sickening dread. Then he looked at his men, their faces closing against him, against Alara. He was their boss. But in that moment, he knew he was on the verge of losing them. He had to make a choice. He turned and looked at Alara, who stood by the cot, her expression calm and focused despite the chaos. She was already crushing fresh herbs, her movements swift and certain. She met his gaze, and in her eyes he saw not witchcraft, but a fierce determination. She was not giving up. He turned back to his men, his voice a low growl that cut through their fearful muttering. "No one is riding anywhere. You'd be dead before you cleared the valley." He took a step forward, placing himself between them and Alara. "She stays. She's the only chance he's got." It was a public declaration, a line drawn in the sand. He was no longer just a desperate man grasping at straws. He was her defender. The men fell silent, their mutinous expressions giving way to a grudging, fearful obedience. Jacob Thorne had spoken, and no one dared to cross him when his voice held that particular edge of cold iron. What followed was a long, desperate battle fought through the darkest hours of the night. Jacob and Alara worked side by side, a silent, unified team against the fever that threatened to consume Caleb. He held the boy's thrashing body down while Alara, her face a mask of concentration, took a small, sharp knife she had sterilized in the fire and lanced the infected wound. Caleb screamed, a raw, animal sound, and Jacob's muscles strained to hold him still. He followed her instructions without question, bringing her basins of cool water, holding the lantern steady, tearing clean cloths into strips. The barriers between them, of race, of social standing, of personal grief, crumbled away in the crucible of that shared crisis. They were no longer a white rancher and a mixed-race healer. They were two people, united in a desperate fight for a life. They moved in a seamless, unspoken rhythm, the grim intimacy of their task forging a bond that transcended words. He saw the sweat beading on her brow in the lantern light, the absolute focus in her eyes. She felt his steady, powerful presence beside her, a solid anchor in the terrifying storm of the boy's fever. As the first pale, gray light of dawn began to filter through the bunkhouse window, the fever finally broke. Caleb's thrashing subsided, and he fell into a deep, peaceful sleep, his skin cool and damp. The angry swelling around the wound had already begun to recede. They stood together in the quiet, grimy bunkhouse, the air thick with the smell of herbs, sweat, and sickness. They were both exhausted, their clothes stained, their faces drawn. Jacob looked at Alara, at the smudge of soot on her cheek and the profound weariness in her eyes. He felt a wave of something he could not name: gratitude, admiration, a deep and powerful respect. They shared a look of profound, bone-deep relief. In that moment, he saw her not as an outsider, not as the town's pariah, but as an equal. She was a partner in a small, desperate victory against the darkness. The storm subsided over the next day, but the snow was piled in deep drifts, making travel impossible. Jacob asked Alara to stay a few more days, to ensure Caleb was truly on the mend. With the immediate crisis over, a new kind of tension settled in the main cabin, one that was quieter but in some ways more profound. The comfortable silence of their shared work was replaced by a more self-conscious quiet. One evening, after they had finished a simple meal of salted pork and beans, they sat before the fire. The flames danced and leaped in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Jacob stared into the fire, lost in thought, the ever-present ache of his grief a dull throb in his chest. He spoke without looking at her, his voice low and rough. "Thomas, my boy." He loved to watch the fire. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and raw. It was the first time in 3 years he had spoken his son's name aloud to another soul. The admission felt like a betrayal of his grief, but also, terrifyingly, like a release. Ilara did not offer the empty platitudes he had come to expect from the people in town. She did not say, "He's in a better place," or, "I am so sorry for your loss." She simply sat in silence, her stillness a respectful vessel for his pain. She understood that some sorrows were too vast for words. After a long moment, she spoke, her own voice soft. "My father taught me to read by a fire just like this," she said, her gaze also fixed on the flames. "He believed words were a kind of magic, a way to keep people with you after they were gone." She gestured to the small, worn book that was never far from her side, which now rested on the small table beside her chair. In that quiet exchange, they offered each other small, broken pieces of their hearts. He had offered the name of his son, she had offered the memory of her father. They recognized in each other the same profound loss, the same deep well of loneliness that had shaped their lives. The conversation did not solve anything, did not lessen the weight of their grief, but it created a fragile thread of connection between them. In the vast, empty landscape of their sorrow, they had found a landmark, a place where another person had stood and understood the view. When the snow had melted enough for a horse to get through, Jacob knew he had to ride into Prosperity for supplies. One of his ranch hands, Daniel, had quit the morning after the fever broke, packing his things in a sullen silence and leaving without a word. Jacob knew the boy was headed straight for town, his mouth full of stories about the woman at the Thorn Ranch. The atmosphere in Prosperity was venomous. As he rode down the main street, he was met with cold shoulders and hostile glares. Men who had known him his whole life turned away as he passed, their faces hard and unforgiving. The news of Ilara staying in his home had spread like a prairie fire. He felt the town's judgment like a physical blow, but it was at the general store that the attack became direct. Martha Blevins, the store owner's wife and the town's self-appointed moral authority, stood behind the counter, her arms crossed, her face a mask of pinched disapproval. "It isn't right, Jacob Thorne," she said, her voice dripping with sanctimony, loud enough for the other customers to hear. "Having that woman in your home, in poor Sarah's home, God rest her soul." The accusation, the implication that he was disrespecting the memory of his wife, cut deeper than any other slight. For a moment, the old, familiar grief threatened to swallow him whole. He wanted to retreat, to ride back to his ranch and pull the silence back around him. But then he thought of Ilara. He thought of her calm competence in the face of death, her quiet dignity in the face of his men's hatred. A surge of protective anger, hot and clean, burned away his grief. He took a step toward the counter, his voice dangerously low, his eyes as cold and hard as river stones. "That woman," he said, each word precise and deliberate, "saved Caleb's life when no one else could. Her name is Ilara Vance, and she is a guest in my home. If you have a problem with that, you have a problem with me." A shocked silence fell over the store. Jacob turned, his back straight, and walked out, leaving his supplies on the counter. The entire town, it seemed, was watching his public act of defiance. The battle lines had been drawn. In defending Ilara, he had chosen to stand with her against the community that had been his entire world. The respect he had once commanded from these people no longer mattered. All that mattered was the respect he was beginning to feel for the quiet, resilient woman waiting for him back at the ranch. He did not tell Ilara about the confrontation in town when he returned, but she saw the change in him. There was a new hardness in the set of his jaw, a new resolve in his eyes. She knew, somehow, that something had shifted, that a price had been paid for her presence in his home. Caleb was now able to sit up in his cot and eat broth on his own. He was weak, but the danger had passed. It was time for her to leave. Her departure was as quiet and awkward as her arrival had been. The snow had melted into a slushy, brown mud. She packed her few belongings, her hands moving with their usual efficiency. Jacob stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching her, a strange feeling of emptiness already beginning to settle in his chest. He tried to press a small leather pouch of coins into her hand. "For your trouble," he said gruffly. She shook her head, gently pushing his hand away. "You gave me shelter from the storm," she said, her voice soft but firm. "We are even." He walked her out to where her horse was tethered. The air was cold and damp, smelling of melting snow and wet earth. As she prepared to mount, he stopped her, his hand lightly touching her arm. He pressed a heavy, folded wool blanket into her hands. It was one of Sarah's, thick and warm. "Winter's not over," he said, his voice rougher than usual to cover the unfamiliar emotion behind the words. It was a practical gift, a simple acknowledgement of the harsh realities of their world. But the gesture was deeply personal. It was a concern for her continued existence, for her well-being beyond the transaction of her healing services. It was an acknowledgement of her as a person. He cleared his throat, avoiding her eyes. "If you ever need anything," he started, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "My door is open." It was a simple offer, but for Alara, a woman to whom no door had ever been truly opened, it was monumental. It was a promise of safety, of acceptance, in a world that had offered her neither. She could only nod, unable to speak past the sudden tight lump in her throat. She mounted her horse and, without a backward glance, rode away down the muddy track. Jacob stood and watched until she was just a small, dark shape against the vast, gray landscape. As she disappeared from view, he was struck by a profound sense of emptiness. He turned and walked back into his cabin, and the silence that greeted him was more acute, more deafening than it had ever been before. Alara rode back toward her own small, solitary home. But this time, the solitude did not feel quite so absolute. It was touched by the memory of a shared crisis, a quiet conversation by a fire, and the unexpected weight of a warm blanket in her hands. It was touched by the glimmer of a possibility she had long since buried, the possibility of kindness, of being seen, of not being entirely alone in the world. Winter fell upon the valley not like a gentle blanket, but like a hammer blow. The brief respite of melted snow was swallowed by a relentless, deepening cold that seemed to leach the very color from the world, leaving behind a vast, stark canvas of white and gray. The mountains disappeared behind a constant curtain of falling snow, and the creek froze solid, its cheerful babble silenced. The landscape, once so beautiful in its autumn gold, was now a place of deadly beauty, where a wrong turn or a moment of carelessness could mean a slow, frozen death. This was the time of isolation, when each ranch and homestead became an island in a sea of white, for Jacob and his two remaining men, Silas and a quiet hand named Ben. It was a season of relentless, back-breaking labor. Their days were a grueling cycle of protecting the cattle that were their livelihood. They rode out in the biting wind to find sections of the herd that had drifted and become trapped in deep snow, their bodies aching with the effort of digging the half-frozen animals out. They took turns with heavy axes, breaking the thick ice on the creek so the cattle could drink, the frigid water splashing onto their clothes and freezing instantly. The physical hardship was a grim sort of blessing for Jacob. The searing cold, the burning in his muscles, the constant, gnawing hunger. These were sensations that crowded out the turmoil in his mind, leaving him too exhausted at the end of the day for anything but a heavy, dreamless sleep. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the fire in his cabin had burned down to glowing embers and the wind moaned around the eaves, his thoughts would invariably drift from his own fortified world to the small, exposed cabin in the foothills. His mind would turn to Alara, A new and unfamiliar feeling had taken root in the frozen ground of his heart. Concern. He would lie in the darkness and wonder if she had enough firewood to last through the deep cold. He pictured her small frame against the howling wind, and he worried. Did she have enough food stored away? Was her roof strong enough to hold the weight of the accumulating snow? Was she safe? This worry was a crack in the icy shell of his grief, a flicker of warmth in a place that had been cold for 3 long years. It was a feeling directed outward, toward another living soul, and its presence was as unsettling as it was persistent. Miles away, in her small cabin, Ilara was engaged in her own solitary fight for survival. She was a creature of this land, and she knew its rhythms, its dangers, and its sparse gifts. She was resourceful and skilled, her days a meticulous routine of checking the snares she had set for rabbits, rationing the dried meat and vegetables in her small root cellar, and constantly reinforcing her cabin against the relentless assault of the wind, stuffing rags and moss into any crack that might admit the cold. She was used to being alone. Solitude had been her companion for most of her life. But the memory of her time at the Thorn Ranch had altered the very texture of that solitude. It was no longer a simple, empty space. It was now punctuated by thoughts of the quiet, grieving man in the valley below. As she huddled by her small fire, she would find her mind drifting to the image of Jacob sitting across from her at his hearth. She remembered the unexpected safety she had felt in his presence, the way his quiet strength had seemed to push back against the chaos of the storm. The heavy wool blanket he had given her was now her most prized possession. At night, she wrapped herself in its thick, warm folds, and it felt like a tangible reminder of the moment a door had been opened to her, a moment of kindness in a lifetime of cruelty. The solitude was still there, but it was now haunted by a possibility, a faint glimmer of connection that both warmed and frightened her. The winter was more than a physical obstacle for them both. It was a time of forced contemplation, a long, silent season in which the seeds of an unlikely connection, planted in a moment of crisis, lay dormant under the snow, waiting for a thaw they could not yet imagine. While Jacob and Ilara struggled with the honest brutality of the wilderness, a different kind of poison was brewing in the snowbound town of Prosperity, trapped by the weather, with little to do but stoke their stoves and their resentments. The townsfolk turned to gossip with a feverish intensity. The story of Jacob Thorne and the woman from the hills had become their favorite tale, a story that was twisted and embellished with each telling, growing more sinister with every repetition. Martha Blevins, still nursing the deep-seated indignation from Jacob's public rebuke, had taken it upon herself to become the primary author of this malicious narrative. At the weekly quilting circle, held in the stuffy parlor of her home, she poisoned the well of public opinion with practiced ease. "It was witchcraft, I tell you," she would whisper to the other women, her needle moving in sharp, angry jabs through the quilt top. "That boy Caleb was on death's door. And then she puts her strange potions on him and he's fine? It is not natural. And now look at poor Jacob Thorne. He was a good, God-fearing man, devoted to the memory of his dear Sarah. Now he's turned his back on the whole town. All for her. She's bewitched him, put a spell on him in his grief." The other women, bored and fearful, would nod in agreement, their own prejudices fertile ground for the seeds of malice Martha was so eager to sow. Another key figure in the town's growing hostility was Jedediah Kane, a rival rancher whose land bordered Jacob's. Kane was a man whose ambition had always outstripped his abilities. He had long been jealous of Jacob's reputation and the prime grazing land the Thorne family had held for 2 generations. He was a bitter, resentful man who saw the world in terms of what he was owed. He saw Jacob's new association with Ilara as a weakness, a crack in the Thorne armor that he could exploit. Kane was too clever to engage in open gossip himself. Instead, he subtly encouraged the rumors, adding fuel to the fire with a well-placed question or a skeptical frown. In the saloon, he would buy a round of whiskey and say, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Strange times when a man like Thorne turns his back on his own kind. Makes you wonder what is really going on up at that ranch." He saw an opportunity not only to damage Jacob's standing in the community, but perhaps to challenge his claim to the water rights along the creek that separated their properties. The deep-seated prejudice against Alara became a convenient tool for his own greed. He framed his own ambition as a righteous crusade, a necessary action to protect the moral fabric of their community. The psychology of the mob began to take hold in prosperity. The fear of the unknown, the suspicion of anyone different, the need for a simple explanation for life's hardships. It all coalesced and found a target in Alara. She became the scapegoat for all their anxieties, the focal point for a hatred that turned decent, hard-working people into a single, hateful chorus. The town's social fabric, already frayed by the harshness of their lives, was being systematically torn apart by suspicion and malice. A break in the storms came in mid-January. The snowfall ceased, and a pale, watery sun appeared in the sky, its light doing little to warm the frozen land. For Jacob, the lull in the weather was not a relief, but an agitation. The worry for Alara, which had been a low hum beneath the surface of his daily struggles, now grew into an insistent roar he could no longer ignore. He invented a reason to ride out, telling Silas he needed to check a distant fence line in the north pasture, a section of the ranch that just happened to lie in the direction of Alara's cabin. Silas had looked at him with a knowing, weary expression, but had said nothing. The ride was slow and difficult, his horse sinking to its belly in the deep snow. But as he crested the last rise, he saw her. She was outside her cabin, a small, determined figure against the vast expanse of white, chopping wood with a steady, rhythmic swing of an axe. The sight of her, so capable and yet so utterly alone in this unforgiving world, solidified something in him. It was not pity he felt, but a profound and overwhelming admiration. He rode closer, and she stopped her work, watching his approach with a guarded expression. Their meeting was less awkward this time, the shared memory of their fight for Caleb's life a silent bridge between them. He dismounted, pulling a heavy sack from behind his saddle. "Extra from my stores," he muttered, setting a large sack of flour and a thick side of salted pork on her doorstep. He avoided her eyes, feeling a strange heat rise in his cheeks. It was a lie, and they both knew it. These were not extras. This was a gift, a deliberate offering. She looked from the supplies to his face, and a small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. Instead of refusing, as he had expected, she simply nodded. "Thank you, Jacob," she said, her voice soft. "Come inside. The kettle is on." Inside her small, warm cabin, the roles were reversed. This was her space, her sanctuary, and he was the guest. The air was filled with the clean, sharp scent of pine and the fainter, more complex aromas of the dozens of bunches of dried herbs that hung from the rafters. A small fire crackled cheerfully in the hearth. He felt large and clumsy in the small, meticulously ordered room. She handed him a steaming mug of herbal tea. It was fragrant and surprisingly sweet. They sat in two simple wooden chairs by the fire, and this time, the silence between them was comfortable, easy. They talked more than they had in all the days they were snowed in together. He spoke of the challenges of the winter, of the cattle he had lost to the cold, of the constant, wearying work. She spoke of the lessons the land taught in the harshest season, how to read the signs of the weather, which trees held the most heat in their wood. They discovered a shared reverence for the harsh beauty of their world, a deep understanding of the thin line between life and death that they both walked every day. His gaze fell upon the small, worn book on the table beside her. He reached out and picked it up. The cover was soft leather, the pages yellowed and fragile. He read the title, embossed in faded gold letters, "The Complete Works of William Shakespeare." He looked at her, his surprise evident on his face. He had known she could read, but this was a sign of an education, of a life of the mind that he could never have imagined for the woman the town dismissed with such contempt. "My father," she said simply, seeing the question in his eyes. He believed a person's mind was the only place they could ever be truly free. Jacob nodded, a new layer of respect settling over him. He looked at her. really looked at her, and saw not just a survivor, but a woman of hidden depths, of quiet intelligence. It was a quiet, domestic moment. Two people sharing a cup of tea and a conversation on a cold winter's day. But it felt like a small, profound act of rebellion against the hostile world that lay just beyond the door of her cabin. It was a simple act of sharing warmth and company, but for them, it was a profound step toward an intimacy neither of them had expected or sought. The reprieve from the weather was short-lived. A week after his visit to her cabin, the worst blizzard of the season descended upon the valley without warning. This was not just a snowstorm, it was a true whiteout, a raging, churning wall of white that erased the world. The wind shrieked with a demonic fury, and the snow fell so thick and fast that it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The storm raged for 2 days, then 3. Jacob was trapped in his cabin, a prisoner of the storm, and his mind was a torment. The worry he had felt for Ilara before was a pale shadow compared to the terrifying certainty that now consumed him. Her cabin was smaller than his, more exposed on its hillside perch. It could not possibly withstand this. The fear for her safety eclipsed everything else, his grief, his ranch, the town's venomous opinions. It was a raw, primal fear that stripped away the last of his emotional defenses and revealed the true, terrifying depth of his feelings for her. He was experiencing the same desperate, clawing helplessness he had felt when his family had been dying. But this time, something was different. This time, he refused to be a passive victim. As soon as the wind died down enough to see the outline of the barn through the swirling snow, he began to prepare. He pulled on his heaviest clothes, saddled Apollo, and stuffed his saddlebags with blankets and a flask of whiskey. Silas found him in the stable, his face a mask of alarm. "Jacob, you cannot be serious," the old man pleaded. "You'll never make it. The snow is chest-deep in the drifts. You'll kill yourself and the horse." "I have to go," Jacob said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He was beyond arguing, beyond reason. He was driven by a singular, desperate need. The journey was a life-or-death struggle, a battle against a world that had become a frozen hell. The landscape was unrecognizable, all its familiar contours buried under a thick uniform blanket of white. He pushed himself and his horse to the very brink of collapse, his body screaming in protest against the cold and the exertion. This journey was the external manifestation of his internal battle, his fight to break free from the paralysis of his past. He was no longer just enduring loss, he was riding out to fight against it, to defy it. He finally reached the grove of aspens where her cabin stood, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. And then he saw it. Her small home was half buried in a massive snowdrift, and the roof had collapsed inward under the impossible weight of the snow. For a heart-stopping moment, he believed he was too late. The silence was absolute, profound, the same dead, empty silence that haunted every corner of his own home. "No," he whispered, the sound stolen by the wind. He threw himself from his horse and staggered through the deep snow to the cabin. He dug frantically at the door with his raw, bare hands, his fingers quickly becoming numb. He screamed her name, his voice a raw, ragged sound of pure anguish. "Ilara!" This was his darkest moment, the culmination of all his past losses crashing down upon him at once. The thought that he had found a glimmer of light, a flicker of warmth in his frozen world, only to have it extinguished, was an agony beyond bearing. He finally tore the broken door from its hinges and tumbled inside. The interior of the cabin was a wreck of splintered beams and deep snow. And then he saw her. She was huddled in a small, protected space under a heavy oak table that had held against the collapse. She was alive, but just barely. Her face was pale and bluish with cold, her body trembling violently. One arm was bent at an unnatural angle. The relief that crashed over him was so immense, so powerful. It brought him to his knees in the snow. He crawled to her, whispering her name over and over, his voice thick with tears. "Ilara, I am here." She was weak from cold and hunger, semi-conscious, but at the sound of his voice, her eyelids fluttered. She recognized him. Her presence in his world had become a necessity. He gently wrapped her in every blanket he had, his hands surprisingly tender as he fashioned a crude splint for her broken arm from a piece of a shattered chair leg. He held her close, sharing his own body heat, his large frame shielding her from the cold. In that moment of shared survival, in the wreckage of her home, their bond was forged into something hard and unbreakable. He had faced the ghost of his past, the specter of loss that had haunted him for 3 years, and this time he had won. He carefully lifted her into his arms. She was as light as a child. He carried her out of the ruined cabin and, with a final surge of strength, lifted her onto his horse. As he mounted behind her, pulling her close against his chest, he knew he was not just saving her from the snow. He was saving himself from the cold, empty prison of his past. He was turning his horse around, leaving the ruin and the silence behind, and bringing life back to his home and to his heart. Spring came to the valley not in a sudden rush, but as a slow, reluctant surrender. The iron grip of winter loosened its hold day by day. The snow, gray and pockmarked, receded from the fields, leaving behind the rich, dark promise of the earth. The creek began to thaw, its voice a low murmur at first, then a cheerful, rushing song as it broke free from its icy prison. The air softened, losing its sharp, biting edge and carrying instead the scent of damp soil and new life. This slow, steady thawing of the land was a mirror to the changes taking place within the walls of Jacob Thorne's cabin. Ilara was healing. Her broken arm, carefully set and bound by Jacob's surprisingly gentle hands, rested in a sling against her chest. The deep cold that had settled into her bones during her ordeal in the ruined cabin was slowly retreating, replaced by the steady warmth of the hearth and the simple comfort of regular meals. The dynamic between them had shifted entirely, transformed by the crucible of her rescue. She was no longer a temporary guest, a stranger brought in by a storm. She had become a part of the house's rhythm, a quiet but constant presence in the landscape of Jacob's solitude. The awkward, heavy silences that had once defined their interactions were replaced by a comfortable companionship. As Jacob worked around the cabin, mending harnesses or sharpening tools, he found himself talking to her. At first, the words were hesitant, rusty from disuse, but soon they began to flow more easily. He told her about the ranch, about his plans to rebuild the herd after the harsh winter. He spoke of the daily struggles and small victories, a newborn calf pulling through a difficult birth, a section of fence finally repaired. He was sharing his life with her, piece by piece, and the act of speaking it aloud made it feel real in a way it had not for years. She, in turn, shared her own world with him. As her strength returned and she was able to walk in the muddy yard, she would point out the first signs of life emerging from the thawing ground. "That's wild onion," she would say, her finger indicating a patch of green shoots. "Good for a spring tonic, cleans the blood." She taught him the names of the birds that were returning to the valley, their songs a new and welcome sound. She had a deep, intuitive knowledge of the land that fascinated him, a wisdom that was as practical as it was profound. Her presence softened the hard edges of his home and of his heart. She brought small touches of life back into the cabin that he had not even realized were missing. A jar of the first pussy willows appeared on the rough wooden table. The smell of her cooking, simple stews and breads, began to permeate the walls, chasing away the stale scent of grief. In the evenings, the quiet rustle of her turning the pages of her worn book by the fire was a sound that brought him a strange and unexpected peace. For Ilara, this period was a revelation. She was experiencing a sense of safety and stability she had never known, not even as a child. In all her life, she had been either an outsider looking in or a solitary survivor bracing against the world. Here, in the home of this quiet, stoic man, she felt safe. She watched him. Seeing past the guarded exterior, he showed the world to the deep well of kindness within. She saw it in the way he cared for his animals, his quiet patience as he helped a struggling newborn calf find its mother's teat. She saw it in the gentle way his large, rough hands would check the bindings on her sling, always careful not to cause her pain. She recognized a gentle soul, one that had been grievously wounded but not broken. The physical closeness required by her recovery bred a profound emotional intimacy. With only one good arm, she was dependent on him for small things she had always taken for granted. He would cut her food for her at meals, help her fasten the buttons on a dress, his fingers brushing against her skin, sending a jolt of awareness through them both. He would steady her with a hand on her elbow as she learned to walk again, her legs still weak from her ordeal. Each touch, however practical, was charged with the intensity of all they had survived together. A powerful, unspoken attraction grew between them, a magnetic pull that was as undeniable as the turning of the seasons. As Ilara's arm healed and her strength returned fully, Jacob was struck by a powerful desire to give her something back, some piece of the freedom she had lost. He knew how much she cherished the wildness of the valley, and he wanted her to be able to explore it again, not as a refugee but as a resident. He decided to teach her to properly ride one of his horses. He chose Willow, a powerful but steady buckskin mare with a gentle temperament. He took Ilara to a wide, open meadow high on the west side of the valley, a place where the spring sun felt warm on their faces and the new grass was a vibrant, impossible green. Initially, she was nervous. The horse was much larger and more powerful than the shaggy pony she had ridden as a child with her father. It was a creature of immense strength, and she felt small and fragile beside it. Jacob was a pillar of patience. His instructions were low and steady, his voice a calming murmur. "Just let her get the feel of you," he said, as he showed her how to hold the reins. His hands, firm and gentle, covered hers for a moment, and the simple contact sent a tremor through her. He helped her mount, his hands spanning her waist to lift her into the saddle, and for a breathless second, she was pressed against his solid chest. He led the horse at a slow walk around the meadow, his large frame striding alongside her, his presence a calming influence that slowly seeped into her bones, quieting her fears. After a while, feeling more confident, she gently urged the mare into a trot, and then a canter. The feeling was exhilarating. The wind sang in her ears and whipped strands of hair across her face. The rhythmic, powerful motion of the animal beneath her was a song of freedom, of life, of strength. A genuine, joyful laugh escaped her lips, a sound that made Jacob's heart ache with a strange and wonderful new feeling. But then, in a flash of brown fur, a jackrabbit darted across their path from a thicket of sagebrush. Startled, Willow shied violently and then broke into a full, panicked gallop. The sudden, uncontrollable surge of speed was terrifying. The world became a blur of green and blue. The exhilarating feeling of freedom vanished, replaced by a primal, gut-wrenching fear. It was too much, too fast. The complete lack of control, the feeling of being carried away by a force she could not stop, triggered a cascade of old traumas. It was the helplessness she had felt watching her father carried away, broken and bloody. It was the slow, inexorable slide of her mother's health. It was the terrifying roar of the collapsing roof as the blizzard tried to bury her alive. All of it came rushing back in a single, overwhelming wave of panic. She screamed, a raw, terrified sound torn from her throat. "Be gentle, it's too fast!" Jacob, riding his own horse a few paces away, understood instantly. He saw the sheer terror in her eyes, the wild panic that went far beyond the simple fear of a runaway horse. He did not yell instructions. He did not grab for the reins abruptly, which might have made the mare panic even more. Instead, he spurred his own horse, Apollo, into a smooth, powerful gallop alongside her. "Easy now, Ilara," he said, his voice calm and soothing, somehow cutting through the roar of the wind and her own fear. "I am right here. Just breathe. Listen to my voice." He spoke to her in a low, steady monotone, talking her through it, his calm strength a lifeline she could cling to in the storm of her panic. Simultaneously, he began to move his own horse, gently and expertly guiding the terrified mare into a wide, slowing circle. The mare, sensing the calm confidence of the other horse and rider, began to respond. Her panicked gallop slowed to a canter, then a trot, and finally a trembling walk. When the horse had come to a complete stop, its sides heaving, Ilara was shaking uncontrollably, hot tears streaming down her face, blurring the green meadow into a watercolor wash. Jacob dismounted in one fluid motion and was at her side. He reached up and lifted her down from the saddle as if she weighed nothing at all. The moment her feet touched the ground, her legs gave way, and she collapsed against him, her body racked with deep, shuddering sobs. He did not say anything. He just held her, his large frame surrounding her, his arms a fortress that made her feel, for the first time since the horse had bolted, completely and utterly safe. "I'm sorry," she whispered into his shirt, her voice muffled and thick with tears. She was embarrassed by her reaction, by her weakness. It wasn't just the horse. It was everything. He smoothed her hair, his rough hand moving with an incredible, surprising tenderness. "I know," he said softly, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "I know." And in that moment, looking up into his steady, compassionate eyes, she understood that he truly did. He was not just humoring her. He understood what it felt like to be swept away by forces beyond your control, to be frozen in place by tragedy and then terrified of moving forward too quickly. He was not just talking about a galloping horse. He was talking about life, about love, about the terrifying speed of healing after years of standing still. This shared understanding, this unspoken acknowledgement of their mutual scars, was the final key that unlocked their hearts. Her fear was gone, replaced by a wave of overwhelming emotion, gratitude for his gentleness, affection for his strength, and a deep, aching desire that was as powerful as it was new. He looked down at her tear-streaked face and vulnerable eyes, and the carefully constructed walls he had maintained around his own heart for 3 long years finally crumbled into dust. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of frantic passion or desperate need. It was a kiss of profound tenderness and release. It was a kiss that tasted of her salty tears and the warm spring sunshine. It was a kiss of shared sorrow and newfound hope, an affirmation of life in the middle of the vast, wild meadow. It was a promise, unspoken but deeply felt, of a new beginning. The kiss changed everything. It was the quiet closing of one chapter of their lives and the gentle, hopeful opening of another. Their relationship moved from one of hesitant companionship to a deep and certain romantic love. The exploration of their physical desire was inextricably intertwined with their emotional healing, each a reflection of the other. Their lovemaking was a slow, careful discovery, a journey into a new and uncharted landscape. For Ilara, it was about learning to trust another person with her body and her soul, to allow herself a vulnerability she had never thought possible. Every touch was a question, and every gentle response from him was an answer that built a new layer of safety, of certainty. For Jacob, it was a reawakening of a part of himself he had believed dead and buried with his wife. He was filled with a sense of wonder, but also a deep-seated fear of causing Ilara any more pain. His grief for Sarah had not vanished, but it had changed. It was no longer an all-consuming darkness, but a sad, sweet memory that could coexist with the new, vibrant life that was blooming in his heart. He was always gentle, always watching her face, her eyes, ensuring she felt safe, cherished, and in control. There were moments of hesitation, of shyness born from years of solitude and sorrow, but they were always overcome by the powerful, undeniable current of their connection. Their intimacy became a sanctuary, a private world they built together, a fortress against the prejudice and judgment that they knew lay just beyond the borders of the ranch. Their love was built in a series of quiet, tender moments. They would fall asleep in front of the fire, her head on his chest, the sound of his steady heartbeat a lullaby. They would work side by side to repair her ruined cabin, not as a place for her to return to, but as an outbuilding for the ranch, transforming a site of trauma into a place of purpose and shared work. They would sit outside on clear nights, wrapped in blankets, and share stories under a vast, star-dusted sky, filling in the empty spaces of each other's pasts. Their love was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, deep, and rooted in the simple, profound reality of their shared lives. But they both knew they could not hide in their sanctuary forever. The world, with all its ugliness, was still out there. They made a conscious decision that they would face it together. The first test came on a warm day in late spring when they needed to ride into Prosperity for supplies. Instead of Jacob going alone, they hitched the wagon, and he helped her up onto the seat beside him. Their arrival was a silent, bold declaration. As they drove down the main street, a hush fell over the town. People stopped what they were doing and simply stared, their faces a mixture of shock, disgust, and open condemnation. Whispers followed them like a plague, a sibilant, ugly sound that made the air feel thick and heavy. From the porch of the general store, Martha Blevins and her circle of friends glared at them, their faces pinched with righteous indignation. Across the street, Jedediah Kane leaned against a post outside the saloon, a slow, malicious smile playing on his lips as he watched them. Jacob felt the town's collective judgment like a physical weight, but instead of flinching, he sat up taller. As they stepped down from the wagon, he placed a protective hand on the small of Ilara's back, a simple, possessive gesture of ownership and defiance that spoke volumes to anyone watching. Ilara, drawing strength from his steady presence, held her head high. She met the hostile glares with a calm, unwavering gaze. She would not be shamed for finding a measure of happiness in a world that had given her so little. They were no longer two separate outcasts, a grieving widower and a shunned woman. They were a united front. This public appearance was their point of no return. They had openly challenged the town's rigid social order, and in doing so, they had painted a target squarely on their backs. As they left town later that day, the supplies loaded in the back of the wagon, it was not with a sense of fear, but with a sober understanding of the battle that lay ahead. Their love had given them the courage to face it. But they were both keenly aware that the glimmer of hope they had fought so hard to find was now under a direct and very serious threat. The sight of Jacob Thorne and Ilara Vance sitting together on that wagon seat, a silent, unshakable unit against the world, was a lit match thrown into the dry tinder of Prosperity's resentment. Their quiet defiance did not quell the town's gossip. It ignited it into a raging fire of open hatred. In the sullen, watchful eyes of the townsfolk, Jacob was no longer a grieving widower to be pitied, but a traitor to his own kind, and Ilara was no longer a shadowy figure on the edge of town, but the brazen cause of his fall. Jedediah Kane watched them leave that day from the saloon, and the malicious smile on his lips was one of pure, unadulterated opportunity. His jealousy of Jacob, a long, simmering stew of bitterness over land, reputation, and a dozen other perceived slights, now had a righteous cause to cling to. He could finally frame his personal resentment as a moral crusade. He saw himself not as a jealous rival, but as the town's protector, its champion against the dark forces that had taken root in its most prominent ranch. He began to conspire, not in secret meetings, but in the open, in the casual, poisoned conversations of everyday life. He found a willing and eager accomplice in Martha Blevins, whose social influence was as potent a weapon as any gun. Together, with a few other influential but resentful townsmen who had always felt overshadowed by the Thorne name, they laid out a simple, brutal plan. Their goal was twofold: to ruin Jacob Thorne's reputation and his financial standing so completely that he would be forced to sell his land, and to drive the woman who had caused it all out of the valley for good. Kane began his assault not with accusations of witchcraft, which some might dismiss as old wives' tales, but with the more tangible and frightening sin of thievery. He started the rumor in the saloon, over a shared bottle of whiskey with a few small ranchers who were struggling after the hard winter. "Funny thing," Kane had said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "I seem to be missing a few of my new calves. Just vanished. No tracks, no sign of wolves." He had paused, letting the implication hang in the smoky air. Thorne seems to be doing well enough, though, almost like his luck turned right around the time that woman of his moved in. He preyed on their superstitions, but more importantly, on their financial anxieties. He painted a picture of Ilara using dark arts or simple, cunning theft to bolster Jacob's herd at their expense. It was a vicious, brilliant lie, because it gave their prejudice a practical, self-serving reason to exist. They were not just hating a woman for her blood. They were protecting their own livelihoods from a supernatural threat. While Cain worked on the men, Martha Blevins worked on the women, weaving her own tapestry of social ostracization. She ensured that the boycott of Jacob's business was absolute. The blacksmith suddenly found that the tools Jacob needed mending were always at the bottom of his pile. The mercantile discovered a sudden shortage of the specific brand of coffee Jacob favored. More importantly, she cut him off from the network of mutual aid that was the lifeblood of any frontier community. If Jacob needed an extra hand for branding, he would find no volunteers. If he needed to borrow a piece of equipment, he would be met with cold refusals. The plan was simple: to create an atmosphere of such intense hostility and suspicion that their life together on the ranch would become an unbearable siege. The conspiracy quickly moved from whispers to actions. The first sign was a cut fence on the western edge of Jacob's property. He and Silas spent a full day rounding up the scattered portion of the herd, their faces grim. It could have been an accident. A wire rusted through. But Jacob knew better. A week later, he found one of his vital irrigation ditches deliberately blocked with rocks and debris, threatening to flood a lower pasture. The most chilling incident was the fire. It was a small blaze, set in a dry, outlying pasture far from the main house. He and Silas spotted the plume of smoke just before dusk and managed to ride out and beat it down with their saddle blankets before it could spread. As he stood there, his lungs burning from the smoke, the smell of scorched earth in his nostrils, Jacob felt a cold fury settle in his heart. These were not just acts of mischief, they were calculated attacks, designed to be deniable, to look like accidents or bad luck. But he knew they were messages, warnings. He knew who was behind them. The pressure mounted relentlessly. The joy he had found with Ilara, the simple peace that had settled in his home, was now tainted by the constant, watchful tension of a man under threat. Men who had once greeted him with a nod now turned their backs when he rode into town. When he tried to sell a few head of cattle to a buyer passing through, the price he was offered was so insultingly low it was clear the man had been spoken to, warned off. He became increasingly tense, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his hand never far from the pistol on his hip. Ilara felt the pressure even more acutely, because she knew, with a certainty that was a cold, hard stone in her stomach, that she was the cause. The love and safety she had found with Jacob felt like a stolen treasure, one that was bringing nothing but ruin upon him. Guilt and fear were constant, gnawing companions. The joy she felt in his arms at night was followed by the terror she felt in the morning, wondering what new hostility the day would bring. One afternoon, she was by the creek, a half-mile from the cabin, gathering the tender shoots of wild mint that grew along the bank. She was so focused on her task, so lost in the simple, peaceful work, that she did not hear them approach. It was a group of town children, none older than 10, their faces disturbingly hard and knowing, mimicking the expressions they had seen on their parents. "There she is," one of the boys said, his voice a cruel imitation of his father's. "The witch!" They began to throw small stones. They were not large enough to cause real harm, but they stung her skin, small, sharp impacts of hatred. "Dirty witch!" a little girl shrieked, her voice high and piercing. "Leave our town alone!" The stones were nothing. The words were everything, in their childish, parroted cruelty. Ilara heard the voice of the entire town, the voice of the world that had always told her she did not belong. She stood frozen for a moment, the mint leaves crushed in her hand, before turning and fleeing back toward the safety of the cabin, the children's taunts following her like a flock of carrion birds. She did not tell Jacob about the incident, but that night, As he held her, he felt a new, heartbreaking tremor in her body and knew that the siege had breached their walls. The dark tragedy of her past, the feeling of being a perpetual, cursed outsider, had resurfaced with a vengeance. The conspirators knew that small acts of sabotage and social shunning were not enough. They needed a final, decisive blow, something that would remove Ilara from the picture for good. The opportunity arose on a sweltering afternoon in early summer. The town's blacksmith, a large, belligerent man named Abel Gable, was found dead in his forge. He lay on the dirt floor, his head crushed, a heavy smithing hammer lying beside him. Gable had been one of the most publicly hostile men in town toward Jacob and Ilara. He had loudly refused to serve Ilara when she had come with Jacob to the smithy, and had taken to spitting on the ground whenever Jacob passed. He was also known to be a heavy drinker, often working at his forge with a bottle of cheap whiskey close at hand. To any rational mind, it was a tragic but simple accident. He had likely been drinking, lost his footing, and fallen, striking his head. But to Jedediah Cain and his cronies, it was a gift from a malevolent god. They seized the narrative before the body was even cold. Cain, his face a mask of grim, sorrowful duty, went directly to the sheriff. He claimed he had been riding past the forge late the previous night and had seen Ilara in the shadows nearby, gathering what he called strange weeds by the light of the moon. Martha Blevins, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and righteous vindication, added her own poison to the story. She swore that she had been in the general store weeks ago when Ilara had threatened the blacksmith after he refused to serve her. "I heard her with my own ears," she declared to a horrified crowd. "She muttered something in that heathen tongue of hers and gave him a look that would curdle milk. It was a curse, I tell you." Together, they concocted a story that was as ludicrous as it was deadly. Ilara, enraged by Gable's disrespect, had used her unnatural, witch-like strength, or perhaps a devil's spell that had made the man fall, to murder him. The town, already primed by months of suspicion and fear, was ready, even eager, to believe it. The story spread from house to house, from the saloon to the church steps, growing more detailed and certain with each telling. The sheriff, a weak-willed man named Miller who valued his elected position far more than he valued justice, found himself cornered. The town was baying for blood, and the most powerful men in that town, Cain and his allies, were demanding action. He buckled under the pressure. He deputized a dozen townsmen, including a smug and triumphant Jedediah Cain, and they rode out toward the Thorn Ranch, their faces grim and determined, the afternoon sun glinting on their rifle barrels. The arrival of the posse was a brutal, terrifying violation. They came not as neighbors, but as an invading army. They surrounded the small cabin, their horses trampling the new spring grass, their rifles held at the ready. Jacob and Ilara had been sitting at the table, sharing a quiet cup of coffee, when the thunder of hooves sent them rushing to the door. Sheriff Miller, his face pale and sweating, dismounted and read the charge from a piece of paper, his voice shaking slightly. "Ilara Vance, I have a warrant for your arrest on the charge of murder, the murder of Abel Gable." The word, murder, hung in the sunlit air, obscene and impossible. Ilara froze, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed to steal the very air from her lungs. All her worst fears, all the nightmares that had haunted her lonely existence, had just become real. Jacob moved instantly, stepping in front of her, his body a solid, immovable shield. His face, which had been so full of gentle love just moments before, was now a mask of cold, deadly fury. "You are out of your mind, Miller," he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Abel Gable was a drunk. He fell. Everyone in town knows it." "I have witnesses. Jacob," the sheriff stammered, avoiding his eyes. "Cain saw her near the forge. Martha Blevins heard her threaten him." "You have liars," Jacob shot back, his voice cutting like a whip. He began to point out the absurdity of the charge, the impossibility of it, but his words were useless. He was not talking to men of reason. He was talking to a mob, and he could see it in their hard, closed faces, from the back of the posse. Jedediah Cain smirked, his eyes glittering with triumph as he enjoyed the sight of Jacob Thorne, the man he had always envied, brought so low, so utterly helpless. Jacob looked from the rifles pointed at his home to the terrified woman behind him. He knew that any resistance would lead to a bloodbath, a fight he could not possibly win. They would kill him and take her anyway. He had no choice. The realization was a bitter, burning acid in his throat. He had to let them take her. He turned his head slightly, his eyes finding hers. In the midst of the chaos and the hatred, he looked directly at her, and his voice rang out with a conviction that cut through the noise. "I will not let them do this," he said, his voice a raw, powerful vow. "I will get you out, I promise you." The deputies moved in then, grabbing her by the arms. She cried out, a small, terrified sound, and was dragged away. Jacob was forced to watch, held back by two men. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his entire body shaking with a rage and despair that eclipsed even the grief he had felt for his family. This was not the passive, inevitable hand of sickness and fate. This was the deliberate, malicious cruelty of men. This was injustice. He watched them put her on a horse and ride away, a small, captive figure in a sea of armed men. This was the ultimate test of his character, his love, his very soul. He was utterly alone, facing a community that had turned on him completely. The woman who had resurrected his soul, who had brought light back into his desolate world, was being taken to a dusty jail cell, likely to be tried by a mob and hanged on the flimsiest of lies. The glimmer of hope that had sustained him through the spring had been completely, brutally extinguished, replaced by the chilling darkness of a future without her. Jacob was left standing in the dust, the sound of the departing horses fading into an unnerving silence. He stood there for a long time, unmoving, as the sun began to dip toward the mountains. Finally, he turned and walked back into his cabin. The silence that greeted him was a living, screaming thing. It was no longer the peaceful quiet of solitude or the comfortable quiet of companionship. It was the absolute, dead silence of absence. His eyes fell on the small jar on the table. The wildflowers she had picked that morning had begun to wilt in the heat. The house, which had become a home again, was just an empty shell. He was hit by a wave of crushing, suffocating despair. The world had taken everything from him once, and now, with a breathtaking cruelty, it had come back for more. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands, the weight of it all too much to bear. For a moment, he collapsed under it, wrestling with the overwhelming temptation to give up, to let the hatred and the darkness win, to simply let his heart stop beating. But then, as he raised his head, his gaze fell on the mantel above the hearth. Lying there was her worn copy of Shakespeare, the book she had carried with her through every trial of her life. He stood up, his movements stiff and slow, and picked it up. The leather cover was soft and familiar in his hand. It was a tangible piece of her spirit, of her unyielding resilience. He thought of her courage, of the way she had faced the world alone for so long, armed with nothing but her knowledge and her quiet dignity. He thought of his promise, the vow he had made to her as they dragged her away. The despair did not vanish, but it began to recede, burned away by the first sparks of a cold, hard resolve. He would not be a passive victim of fate again. He would not stand by and watch loss happen. He would fight. He would not try to reason with a mob. He would dismantle their lies, piece by piece, until their whole rotten conspiracy collapsed under the weight of the truth. His love for Ilara, a love that had been born in gentleness and had healed his broken soul, was now transformed. It was no longer just a comfort. It had become a weapon, a shield, a fire of righteous fury that would either expose their darkness or burn their whole town to the ground. The despair that had crushed Jacob in the moments after they took Ilara did not last. It was too heavy a burden to carry for a man who now had a war to fight. By the time the sun had fully set, the grief had burned away. leaving behind the cold, hard ash of resolve. He would not be broken by this. He would not be a victim. He would be the hammer that shattered their lies. He wasted no time. He knew that riding into prosperity and shouting about injustice would accomplish nothing but getting himself shot or thrown in the cell next to hers. Logic and reason were useless against a mob drunk on its own righteousness. He needed proof, cold, undeniable proof that would be as solid as the anvil in the blacksmith's forge. His first act was to ride east, not west toward town. He rode through the night, the promise he had made to Ilara a burning coal in his chest, pushing him onward. He arrived at dawn in Miles City, a larger, more cynical town an hour's ride away. There, he sought out a man named Alistair Finch, an aging attorney with a reputation for taking on impossible cases. Finch was a man whose belief in justice had long been eroded by the realities of the frontier, but his belief in the power of a well-argued case and a hefty fee remained unshakable. Finch listened to Jacob's story in his dusty, book-lined office, his sharp, intelligent eyes missing nothing. He stroked his gray beard, his expression unreadable. "It is a mob, Mr. Thorne," he said when Jacob had finished, his voice a dry rasp. "And a mob does not listen to reason. They listen to fear and shame, to win. We must not only prove her innocence, we must prove their guilt. It will be expensive." Jacob had known it would be. He had ridden to Miles City with the deed to the northeastern section of his ranch in his saddlebag, 160 acres of the best grazing land in the valley, with direct access to the creek. The next morning, he rode back to Prosperity and went directly to the one man he knew would buy it without asking questions. The meeting with Jedediah Kane was a bitter pill to swallow. Jacob stood in his rival's gaudy parlor, the air thick with the smell of Kane's cheap cigars, and endured the man's smug, triumphant gaze. Kane knew exactly why Jacob needed the money. The irony was thick enough to choke on. "Trouble at home, Thorne?" Kane had asked, feigning concern. "I am selling the northeast pasture," Jacob said, his voice flat, his face a mask of stone. The deal was made. The price was insultingly low, but it was enough. As Jacob left Kane's ranch, the money in his pocket felt both heavy and light, the weight of the land he had lost, and the lightness of the weapon he had just bought. The act was a painful, bitter sacrifice, but it was also a strategic masterstroke. It was a public declaration of his absolute commitment, a signal to the whole valley that he would burn his own legacy to the ground to save her. And it put his enemy in the exquisitely awkward position of having funded the very defense he was trying to crush. With the lawyer secured, Jacob began his own investigation, channeling the white-hot rage that threatened to consume him into cold, methodical action. He started at the scene of the alleged crime. He went to the blacksmith's forge, which had been locked and shuttered by the sheriff. He broke the lock without a second thought. Inside, the air was stale, smelling of cold iron, coal dust, and old whiskey. He examined the space with a rancher's eye for detail, searching for anything the sheriff's cursory glance might have overlooked. He noted the position of the body, which Silas had described to him in detail. He saw the dark stain on the dirt floor next to the massive anvil. He saw the heavy hammer, which lay a few feet away, as if it had been knocked from a hook, not dropped from a killer's hand. Nothing felt right. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned tools, no scattered debris. It looked exactly like what it was, the site of a clumsy, tragic accident. His next stop was the human terrain of the town itself. He needed to find the cracks in the wall of certainty that Kane and Blevins had built. He sought out the few people who might still possess a conscience, or at least a healthy fear of being caught on the losing side of a fight. He approached Abel Gable's wife, the very woman whose son Ilara had saved from a fever. He found her hanging laundry behind her small house, her movements jerky and fearful. She tried to turn away when she saw him, but he blocked her path. He did not threaten her. He did not even raise his voice. He simply spoke of her son. "I remember when your boy was sick," he said, his voice low and steady. I remember Alara riding through a storm to help him. She sat with him through the night. She asked for nothing in return. Is that the act of a murderer, Mrs. Gable? She would not meet his eyes, her hands twisting in her apron. I do not know anything, she whispered, her voice trembling. They say you were a witness to a threat, Jacob continued, his gaze unwavering. They say you heard her curse your husband. You and I both know that is a lie. A lie has a way of growing, Mrs. Gable. And when it gets found out, it crushes everyone who helped it grow. He left her then, having planted a seed of doubt and guilt in the fertile ground of her fear. He also sought out Silas, his one loyal hand, and together they spent an evening in the bunkhouse, poring over the timeline of the day Gable had died. They questioned every detail of the stories told by Kane and Blevins, looking for the inconsistencies, the small cracks that would eventually bring the whole lie crashing down. The turning point, the first real glimmer of hope, came from a completely unexpected source. The town doctor, a man named Elias Reed, finally returned from a 2-week trip to visit his sister in Bozeman. Dr. Reed was a man of science and logic in a town that often preferred superstition and rumor. He was a quiet, bookish man who viewed most of the town's hysteria with a kind of weary disdain. He had been the one to officially pronounce Abel Gable dead, and while he had kept his own counsel amidst the rising tide of mob mentality, he had noted things that did not fit the narrative of a violent struggle. Hearing of the doctor's return, Jacob sought him out immediately. He found him in his small office, the air smelling of carbolic acid and old paper. Jacob laid out his own findings, his suspicions about the lack of a struggle, his conversation with Mrs. Gable. He spoke not with the passion of a desperate lover, but with the cool, rational determination of a man seeking the truth. Dr. Reed listened patiently, his fingertips steepled under his chin. He had a quiet, professional respect for Alara's knowledge of herbs, which he did not see as witchcraft, but as a form of primitive but effective ethnobotany. He had seen the results of her work on Caleb firsthand. I must admit, Mr. Thorne, I found the circumstances of Abel's death peculiar. Doctor, Reed said finally, the nature of the head wound, a single crushing blow, and the position of the body were more consistent with a simple, unbraced fall than with a struggle. He agreed to help. Together, they returned to the forge that night. With his trained medical eye, Dr. Reed was able to see things Jacob had missed, but the crucial discovery came not in the forge itself, but in the small, filthy living quarters attached to the back. Rummaging through the squalor of Gable's room, Dr. Reed found a half-empty bottle of a potent, heart-straining patent medicine, a tonic sold by a traveling quack who had passed through the valley a month before. I know this concoction, Doctor, Reed said, holding the bottle up to the lantern light. It is mostly alcohol and laudanum, with a bit of strychnine to give it a kick. It is notorious for causing dizzy spells and heart palpitations, especially when mixed with liquor. Suddenly, all the pieces clicked into place. Dr. Reed theorized that Gable, likely already drunk, had taken a swig of the potent tonic. He had suffered a dizzy spell, stumbled and fallen, striking his head on the corner of the massive anvil with the full, unbraced force of his own considerable weight. The hammer had simply been knocked from its hook on the wall by his fall. It was a simple, logical, and medically sound explanation for what had happened. It was the truth. Armed with Dr. Reed's medical evidence and a growing list of inconsistencies in the witnesses' stories, Alistair Finch rode into town. He formally demanded a public inquest rather than a rushed trial, a legal maneuver that Sheriff Miller, faced with a real lawyer and the threat of being made to look like a fool, could not refuse. The inquest was held in the town hall, a large, stuffy room that was packed to the rafters with the hostile, curious faces of the people of prosperity. Alara sat beside Finch at a small table at the front, her face pale but her back straight, her dignity a silent rebuke to the hatred directed at her. Jacob sat in the first row, his presence a solid, unwavering anchor of support. Finch systematically and brilliantly dismantled the town's case. He began by calling Dr. Reed to the stand, the doctor with unassailable scientific authority, presented his medical findings, explaining in clear, simple terms how the evidence pointed not to murder, but to a tragic, self-induced accident. He produced the bottle of tonic, and his testimony cast the first serious shadow of doubt over the room. Next, Finch called a sputtering, indignant Martha Blevins to the stand. Under his calm, relentless cross-examination, her story of the overheard threat quickly unraveled. He forced her to admit the exact time and place she had supposedly heard Alara's curse. He then produced the mercantile's own ledger, which showed that Jacob had purchased supplies at that exact time, and 3 witnesses who swore that Alara had been waiting for him in the wagon outside, on the opposite side of the street, caught in a clear and public lie. Martha Blevins dissolved into a fury of self-righteous excuses, her credibility shattering before the entire town. The climax of the inquest came when Finch called his final, surprise witness, Mrs. Abel Gable. She walked to the stand, her face a mess of tears and guilt, refusing to look at Jedediah Kane, in a halting, broken voice. She confessed everything. She told the inquest that Kane had come to her the night after her husband's death. He had pressured her to lie, to back up his story about seeing Alara near the forge. He had promised to forgive her husband's substantial debt at the general store, a debt that would have left her destitute if she would only say she had seen Alara that night. Her confession caused an uproar in the town hall. All eyes turned to Jedediah Kane, whose smug, confident expression had evaporated, replaced by a mask of panicked denial. He began to shout that she was a liar, a hysterical woman. But it was too late. The tide of public opinion, so easily manipulated, was now turning against him with a terrifying speed. Finch delivered the final blow by calling Silas to the stand. The old ranch hand testified that 2 of Kane's own men, drunk on whiskey in the saloon, had been bragging about how Kane had paid them to cut Jacob's fences and set the fire in his pasture. The conspiracy unraveled completely. The web of lies, which had seemed so strong and impenetrable, was torn to shreds in the space of an hour. Sheriff Miller, seeing the mood of the room shift from a lynch mob to an angry crowd demanding a new villain, and fearing for his own political future, had no choice. He stood and, in a loud, forceful voice designed to absolve himself of all blame, declared the charges against Alara Vance dropped. He then turned and, with a new and righteous fury, arrested a sputtering, defeated Jedediah Kane for conspiracy and perjury. Alara was freed. She walked out of the town hall into the bright afternoon sun, blinking as if waking from a long and terrible nightmare. Jacob was there, waiting for her on the steps. He said nothing. He simply opened his arms, and she fell into them, burying her face in his chest in a raw, emotional embrace that was a release of all the terror and a confirmation of all their hope. They had won. Justice, in its own slow, brutal way, had been served. But as they stood there, holding on to each other, they looked out at the faces of the townspeople who had gathered to watch. They saw no acceptance, no relief, no apology. They saw sullen resentment. They saw the downcast eyes and flushed faces of people forced to confront their own ugly, gullible hatred. They had been vindicated, but they were more outcast than ever. They had not just proven Alara's innocence, they had exposed the town's ugly heart, and for that, they would never be forgiven. They realized with a chilling certainty that while they may have won the legal battle, they could not win the war against such deep-seated prejudice. Staying in prosperity would mean a life of constantly looking over their shoulders, of living amongst people who had been ready, even eager, to see her hang. The victory felt hollow. The cost, a prime section of Jacob's land, their peace of mind, their sense of home, immeasurably high. That night, back at the ranch, they sat by the fire, the home that had been both a prison of grief and a sanctuary of love. The air was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now, one filled with unspoken understanding. It was Alara who spoke first. "This is not a home anymore, is it?" she said softly, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Jacob looked at her, at the quiet strength that had endured so much, and he knew she was right. "No," he said. "It is not." The decision was made in that quiet moment, a silent, mutual agreement that was as solid and certain as the love between them. They would leave, they would sell the ranch, what was left of it, and go somewhere new, somewhere the name Thorne did not carry the weight of generations, and the name Vance was not a curse. The West was vast. Somewhere out there, under a different sky, there had to be a place where they could build a life on their own terms, away from the ghosts of his past and the hatred of the present. The decision was not one of defeat, but of profound strength and ultimate hope. It was an acknowledgement that their love and their future were more important than any piece of land, any legacy, any community. They were their own community now, their own nation of two. They spent their last days in the valley packing their essential belongings onto a sturdy wagon. The work was not sad, but filled with a sense of liberation, of shedding a heavy, painful skin. Jacob went through the old chest at the foot of his bed and packed the few mementos he had of Sarah and Thomas, a small tintype photograph, a lock of his son's baby hair. For the first time, he was able to see them not as anchors pulling him down into an ocean of grief, but as part of the long, painful, and ultimately beautiful journey that had led him to Ilara. Ilara, in turn, carefully packed her worn copy of Shakespeare and the bundles of essential herbs that were the symbols of the heritage that made her who she was. On the final morning, they climbed onto the wagon seat and, without a backward glance at the cabin, urged the horses forward. They paused on a high ridge at the edge of the valley, the same ridge from which they had first seen the promise of spring. They looked back one last time at the land that had been the setting for so much pain and so much love. The landscape was beautiful, bathed in the clean, clear light of a new morning. They were not running away from their pasts, they were carrying them forward, woven into the fabric of who they had become. He reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers, his touch gentle and sure. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and a feeling of profound, untroubled peace settled over her for the first time in her life. They did not know exactly where they were going, but they were going there together. Jacob clucked to the horses, and the wagon creaked forward. They turned away from the valley of prosperity and faced the vast, open horizon, their path forward clear and bright and entirely their own. Their romantic love, forged in the crucible of dark tragedy and social injustice, had become their ultimate survival, their truest justice, and their unending glint of hope against the wilderness. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire tonight. Let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect, and be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.